Bart, great to talk to you again.
Thanks.
I'm going to try to make you a little less angry this time than sometimes we do.
Good luck.
We'll see. We've got a bunch of evangelical scholars, most of whom are not saying anything bad about you. But
my blood pressure is already lowering.
Well, fortunately, Bart has managed to conceal from his readers a perfectly natural explanation. It is a hard thing to say, but in my judgment, this is not the work of an honest man. He's deliberately trying to pull one over on his readers. I don't appreciate it as somebody who has to counsel people who are thrown off balance by Bart Ehrman's shenanigans.
Oh, okay. Okay. We'll consider that in advance.
That's a win. Welcome to Paulogia, where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians. Today, we're joined once again by Dr. Bart Ehrman, world-renowned Bible scholar who recently launched a course called The Genius of Matthew, What Scholars Say About the First Gospel.
Matthew's the most read book of the New Testament. You know, I'm not myself a Christian believer, but there's a lot of genius in this book, and people overlook it, I think, because of the way they read it. And so it's 8 lectures trying to unpack Matthew in ways that many people wouldn't expect, trying to show there's a lot of subtlety in Matthew that people don't catch. But most people have no clue really what Matthew's trying to emphasize or what his distinctive message is. And so it's a really important book. And so I try to talk about all sorts of stuff about Matthew that is based on scholarship, but is reaching out to people who are not scholars.
People can sign up for that course by visiting tinyurl.com/BartMatthew. And we'll talk about that a little more later. But I personally am very excited about it because Matthew is my absolute favorite book of the Bible for 2 reasons. First, Matthew paid for my Bible college. When I was 17, I memorized the entire book, minus the genealogies, and competed across North America in Bible quizzing, earning scholarships.
Wow, that's impressive. You know, if you went to Moody Bible Institute, they don't have any tuition, so you wouldn't have had to do that.
Oh, wow. We aren't so lucky up here in Canada. For some reason, Bible college is more expensive than regular college up here. So,
whoa, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
But the second reason was I was a very black and white thinker when I was a Christian. And what I liked about Matthew was that it presented what I considered evidential arguments for prophecy. It said something about Jesus, then provided a proof text for it from the Old Testament.
Oh, yeah. Well, proof texting is when you've got some idea and you kind of pick a text that supports your idea, whether the text, in its context really means that or not. You just, and so you prove it by just citing a text. And it's considered by historical scholars to be an illegitimate way of reading the Bible. You can't do like pick and choose, although everybody does, of course. And so that's when somebody does, that's proof texting.
And there's no question that some of Matthew's interpretation is homiletical as well. In other words, there are certain things that you would say are proof texts, are fundamental.
Well, yeah, I mean, certainly. I mean, in the, especially, it starts off that way in the birth narratives where he wants to show that, Jesus is born of a virgin, and because Isaiah predicted it, Isaiah 7:14, and he's born of Bethlehem because Micah chapter 5, verse 2 predicts it. And these are passages that weren't originally about, a Messiah being born in Bethlehem or by a virgin, but Matthew uses them that way. So yeah, it is an ancient form of proof texting.
Well, today I'm wanting to talk about 4 passages in Matthew that I once viewed as proof texts, but have since come to learn are quite problematic for the view that the Bible is inerrant or that the author of Matthew was an excellent Hebrew scholar. And we'll also look at the evangelical apologists who have come up with their own reasons why these aren't problems.
Okay.
Let's start with the 2 donkeys during the triumphal entry.
Supposed biblical error. Did Jesus ride 2 donkeys into Jerusalem? In the Gospel of Matthew, it records that the disciples brought Jesus a donkey and its colt. They brought the donkey and the colt and put on them their cloaks, and he sat on them.
In Matthew, says Bart, Jesus' disciples procured 2 animals for him, a donkey and a colt. They spread their garments over the 2 of them, and Jesus rode into town straddling them both. It's an odd image, but Matthew made Jesus fulfill the prophecy of Scripture quite literally, riding on an ass and on a colt the foal of an ass. Ha, 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 he's doing a circus trick. He's riding both animals at once. How funny. What's the first thing that we do when Bart quotes Scripture? We read the text for ourselves. They brought the donkey and the colt and put on them their cloaks, and he sat on them. What's the antecedent of that last them? Is it the donkey and the colt, or is it their cloaks. Well, grammatically, either one could be it. But when we look at A.T. Robertson's commentary on Matthew, and Robertson was a great Greek scholar, Robertson just dryly remarks, the garments, of course. The words in Greek might refer to the two animals, but such reference is by no means necessary. Matthew is not careful to distinguish, but common sense can do it. Let's not be stupid. Enough said. But you see what Bart did? He gets a chuckle out of his audience and he moves on, having made the authors of Scripture seem to be bereft of common sense.
I guess I'm just, too stupid to understand. I do my best not to be stupid. So the point that Matthew makes is precisely that this is fulfilling what is said about he's mounted on an ass and on a colt, the foal of a donkey. And so they bring him the ass and the donkey. So they bring him two animals. That's not what happens in Mark or Luke. And so you have to ask, why two animals? And when it says it spread the cloaks on them, it doesn't say like on one of them for him to sit on. It says on them. And so I'm just looking at the Greek here because I wasn't expecting this question, and so I didn't exactly read the text before. So it's verse 7, and they lay the garments on them, and he said, okay. So all right. So it's actually pretty clear because it says it uses the same Greek words. They spread them upon them, and then it says, and he sat upon them. So, which them is he talking about? Well, okay, you tell me. but grammatically. So let me just say, I didn't make this up. It's not like this is my stupid reading. The person who actually convinced me of this reading is John Meyer, who's Tim won't like this, but he's a Roman Catholic scholar who wrote one of the really very best commentaries on the Gospel of Matthew. And he was a very committed Christian and a very devout Roman Catholic. But he used this passage to say that in his judgment, Matthew was probably not Jewish, because Matthew's taking this synonymous parallelism from Zechariah and doesn't seem to realize that it's synonymous parallelism. And so he has two animals. And the way the synonymous parallelism works in Zechariah is that you state one line. This is how it happens in all the poetry in the Old Testament. You state a line, and then the second line says the same thing in other words. And so it's kind of reinforcing it. But Matthew's obviously taking it in some kind of literal way. So I'm not saying that Matthew is stupid, although Tim's saying I'm stupid, but that's okay. I'm not saying that Matthew is stupid. What I am saying that he's taking this image literally in a way that doesn't really make any sense to show that Jesus literally fulfilled it. And that's John Meyer's argument. It's kind of a common argument. I think it's kind of maybe it's meant to be humorous. I don't know, but he does sit on them. And so I don't know.
Craig Keener says, as in later Palestine, one would drape the garments on which Jesus sat across both the mother and the colt, although Jesus would ride only one. The them on which he sat could mean the garments. In other words, given the festive nature of the event, it would be expected both animals would be covered in garments. The mother was there to keep the young colt calm.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that even evangelicals like Craig Keener can be stupid too.
And Matthew gets the key section of the quote from the Hebrew and not merely from the Greek Septuagint. This is important because in the Hebrew passage Matthew knows about and quotes from, the Hebrew word for donkey is masculine. But in the narrative of verse 7, the word for donkey is presented with a feminine article. So between the quote and the narrative, there is not a perfect correspondence. Matthew seems aware that Zechariah was speaking about a male donkey, since it is clear in his narration the other animal was a female, breaking the direct link with the quoted passage.
Well, that's out there. I don't know. I mean, I'm not looking at the Hebrew here, but I'm just saying. Oh man, yeah, no, that's that. Yeah, that's so okay. I'd have to look at the Hebrew, but it sounds
fair enough.
It sounds like an incredible stretch to me. But Matthew's not reading it in Hebrew. Matthew doesn't quote the Hebrew Bible. He quotes the Greek translation. And so what the Hebrew has to do with it, I don't know.
Furthermore, it is unlikely Matthew misunderstood the passage from Zechariah, given that scholars like Craig Keener and Robert Gundry note elsewhere throughout his gospel, he displays knowledge of Hebrew and comprehensive knowledge of the Scriptures. Even in this passage, Matthew translates from the Hebrew more literally than the Septuagint does.
Yeah, I don't think there's much evidence that he was looking at the Hebrew generally. When you look at his quotations, it's pretty clear that he's not tempering his quotations by the Hebrew. He's going with the Greek in the places you can check.
Well, let's jump to Matthew 2:23, where the author cites a prophecy that isn't actually in the Old Testament.
Supposed Bible contradiction. Matthew's prophecy versus Old Testament prophecies. Matthew closes his birth narrative of Christ by saying, "And he went and lived in a city called Nazareth, so that what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled, that he would be called a Nazarene."
What prophet said that? Not written anywhere. No prophet said that. You won't find it anywhere. Matthew made it up. It's not only that he quoted verses out of context, it's not only that he stuck extra words in that didn't belong, it's not only that he twisted the meaning of other verses, he just made it up sometimes. Guess he hoped nobody would notice.
Is Matthew is referring to Old Testament passages that say the Messiah will be a branch. For example, Isaiah 11:1 says, "There shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch from his roots shall bear fruit." In Hebrew, the word for branch is netzer, which is the same order of the three primary letters for Nazareth. And some scholars argue Nazareth is derived from netzer. So Matthew may be using the root meaning of Nazareth to refer to how the prophets referred to the Messiah as a branch.
You say, well, how do I know Matthew had that in mind? Well, we saw that one of the titles of the Messiah was branch. We saw it in Jeremiah 23, we saw it in Zechariah 3, we saw it in Zechariah 6. Semach, branch. The prophets referred to that. What's the word that Isaiah 11:1 uses for branch? That a branch will come out of the stump of Jesse and grow up from the roots. The word there is netzer. Netzer. It seems very clear. I mean, you find, listen to me. If we had Orthodox rabbis sitting here, they could recite to you off the top of their head plays on words in rabbinic literature, constantly plays on words, where words are cited and a similar word is cited. No, read it this way, back and forth. Matthew is finding this extraordinary little play on words. He will actually be a netzer. The prophets then expanded on this in other places. He'll be called a netzer, a branch. Other prophets referred to him as a branch.
Yeah, I actually suggested this in the course on Matthew that I just did, that this may be the best way to explain what Matthew has in mind. It would presuppose that in this case, he either knows Hebrew or he had a Hebrew informant tell him about this thing about netzer. And it may have been a tradition that was floating around before Matthew about the netzer thing. So the deal is that in Isaiah 11:1, there is a prediction that there will be a root, that the stump of Jesse, they'll produce a root and there'll be a branch that grows out of it. And this is saying that the tree of David. So if you think about a genealogical line like a genealogical tree, David was supposed to have a genealogical descendant on the throne in perpetuity, according to 2 Samuel chapter 7. And then the line got cut off with the Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem. And so the tree got cut down. And Isaiah is saying there's going to be a root will come out of the tree and there'll be a branch. In other words, it's going to come back to life. And the branch, the word for branch in Hebrew is natsar. And Hebrew doesn't use, the Hebrew Bible, the ancient Hebrew didn't use vowels. And so it just has three letters, which would be in English N-Z-R, which are also the three letters in Nazarene. And so he'll be called a Nazarene, would be, could be a reference to Isaiah 11:1. And if that's the case, then the Matthew in this particular case is being very kind of creative and subtle. And I have no problem with that. I think Matthew was a very creative person. I mean, my lecture was on the genius of Matthew, and he did a lot of creative things. This would be sort of at the top of the list, I think, of creative things, because not too many people get that one.
Right.
So
by creative, you mean thinking outside the box creative.
Well, Matthew sees Jesus everywhere in the Old Testament, and he doesn't play it out as much as he probably did in his own life, whoever this person Matthew was. But Christians, since then find Jesus everywhere, from Genesis 1 through, the first chapter of Genesis to the final chapter of Malachi. People find Jesus everywhere. And that started in the early church. I mean, if you think that Jesus is the fulfillment of God's plan, as Matthew did, then naturally you'll try to find him in Scripture. And so that's where that's where his creativity comes from, is trying to find creative ways of seeing where Jesus could be in the Old Testament. And this would be one of the more creative ones, I think.
So it sounds like you buy that one as plausible, at least.
Yeah.
A more likely possibility is Matthew is not quoting a specific Old Testament passage, but is referring to a collective theme taught by various prophets. To be a Nazarene was not looked on as a good thing by the Jews. Nazareth was not a place of high praise. John 1:46 says that Nathanael asked, "Can any good come out of Nazareth?" It is likely the term Nazarene for the Jews was not just a term of origin, but a term for one from that area that was despised. It would be like calling someone from the South a Southern hillbilly. It refers to their origin, but it is also used to insult them. Second, look at what Matthew says. He doesn't say it was spoken by a prophet, but spoken by the prophets, plural. It seems that Matthew was referring to several Old Testament passages that speak of the Messiah being despised by others, and using the term Nazarene because it carried that despised meaning for his Jewish audience he was writing to. In the same way, if I called someone a Southern hillbilly, a foreigner might think I was referring to their origin, but to us, it would also have been used as a term of despise and insult. So Matthew may just be referring to Old Testament passages that talk of one being despised, and using the area Jesus came from as a way to show this.
Does that ring true to you? Does that have any merit, do you think?
Not historically. I mean, I think theologically it makes sense. The reason it doesn't work historically is because you don't have any reference to Nazareth in any literature before Matthew. And so you can't say that it was a slur of some kind. The reason this person's saying it's a slur is probably because of what's said in the book, in the Gospel of John, written later, that, can anything good come out of Nazareth? One of the problems with Nazareth for early Christians and some today is that Nazareth was such an unknown little place. It's never mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. It's not mentioned in Josephus. It's not on a map or anything. It's like, this is the first. And so it's just this tiny little place. And so there was nothing that made it particularly bad as opposed to, the other million small places in the world. But so I think this is presupposing that the slur of John was floating around before Matthew, decades earlier, where there's no evidence of that. And it's also presupposing that passages like Isaiah, the Isaiah passage and these other passages are referring to a Messiah. And, they're not.
Well, you can't convince a Christian that I shouldn't say anything. Yeah.
You could. I was a Christian. I came to think when I was being a Christian.
The kind of Christian I was would have definitely been happy to say that any verse was potentially,
Yeah, me too. I mean, when I was a fundamentalist. Yeah.
Let's move on to
Matthew 27, verses 9 and 10. We're told that Matthew's totally confused here. First, he quotes part of a prophecy from Zechariah. Then he says it comes from Jeremiah. Then he takes the whole thing totally out of context. How can you possibly believe in the inspiration of the New Testament, or that Matthew was writing accurately with something this botched and garbled?
Well, it's a mistake.
Okay, it's a mistake, which is unacceptable if you believe in inerrancy, I suppose.
Well, there are, I think when I was a conservative evangelical, we probably said something like, it's in that part of the Bible where Jeremiah is like a key book or something. I don't know. And so it's like subsumed under like what the big book in the area is, who the big boy is. Yeah.
That's exactly what James White proposes.
When a Old Testament text is being cited, the fundamental mechanism the Jewish people would use would be to utilize the greater prophet's name rather than a minor prophet's name. And it's not just because that makes it more important, it made it easier to find. That is, remember, they were reading from scrolls. And so the scrolls would be broken up into having the major prophet at the beginning. It's sort of a practical thing, and simply being able to find something, for us, it's real easy. We whip open a book. They didn't use the codex. They used a scroll. And so in some situations where we have Old Testament citations, the major prophets being used because it was easier to find the citation.
Yeah, that doesn't work.
Okay, why does that not work?
Well, because Jeremiah would have been on a different scroll from the minor prophets. The minor prophets are collected together. The 12 prophets are put together on the same scroll. Jeremiah itself takes up a large scroll. And so it's not telling you where to find this book. Even if it was, what kind of sense does that make? You mean, okay, so you got this like 80-foot scroll or something that has Jeremiah on it, and started Jeremiah, and then it's got these 12 other books. Like how does it help you find it? So they don't have chapters and verses, right? And so like you get the scroll that has Jeremiah on it, and the Jeremiah part goes for about 30 or 40 feet, and then you're kind of unrolling this thing, and you're trying to find Zechariah. What good does it do you to tell you that it's in the Jeremiah scroll? That doesn't make any sense. So yeah, no, but they would have been on separate scrolls, and so it doesn't really work.
Okay. Well, you'll be happy to know that Dr. Michael Brown thinks that it's equally ridiculous.
And the idea that it was part of a larger scroll, and it's possible many Christians use that explanation. I'm in no way convinced of it.
He has his own creative hypothesis.
Why did he make reference to Jeremiah? Wasn't this prophecy close enough? Why didn't he just say Zechariah? Why did he make reference to Jeremiah? There's a reason for it. There's a reason for it. Any reader familiar with the scriptures would have known that the verse itself was drawn from Zechariah, not Jeremiah. So there must be something else to which Matthew was pointing. Now, some said, well, maybe he talks about the potter in Jeremiah 18. Interesting, but no real connection. Well, he buys a field in Jeremiah 32. Is it talking about buying the field? No. I don't think so there. Jeremiah 19. This is the larger prophecy, Jeremiah 19 and Zechariah 11. Check this out. Jeremiah 19, the prophet is commanded by the Lord to buy a clay jar from a yotzer potter. And he's to take it in the presence of the elders and the priests. Remember Matthew 27, the chief priests and the elders? And he's to go to the valley of Ben Hinnom near the entrance of the potsherd gate. And he's to proclaim a word of solemn judgment. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Listen, I'm going to bring a disaster on this place that will make the ears of everyone who hears it tingle. 19:11, this is what the Lord Almighty says. I will smash this nation and the city just as this potter's jar is smashed and cannot be repaired. Now, look at this. 19:4. Not only would God destroy Jerusalem because of its idolatry, but also because, quote, they have filled this place with the blood of the innocent. Matthew 27:4. What does Judas say? I have betrayed innocent blood. What happens to Jerusalem as a result of the betrayal of innocent blood in Jeremiah's day? City destroyed. What happens to Jerusalem as a result of the betrayal of the Messiah and shedding of innocent blood? City destroyed. And interestingly, just a linguistic connection, Yotzer, potter, connected with Jeremiah 19 and connected with Zechariah chapter 11. So what was Matthew actually saying here? What was Matthew actually saying? He's saying, remember the potter. Remember the blood guilt. Remember Jeremiah's prophecy about the destruction of our city and temple. It happened just as he said it would. And today there's even greater blood guilt with even greater consequences. We betrayed God's Son. We've given the Messiah over to death. Judgment is near. So by citing Zechariah, which is very literal, with the 30 pieces of silver now being taken and given to the potter, and Jeremiah says yes, Matthew says yes to buy the field, the potter's field. Messiah betrayed for 30 pieces of silver. He cites Zechariah, but he references Jeremiah to make you dig deeper. And then you realize, oh my, blood guilt. Chief priests and elders seeing this, complicit, not repenting. Potter, field of blood, valley of slaughter, foreigners buried. Wow. Jeremiah, speaking of this. Zechariah, speaking of this. Matthew ties them together.
Does that make any sense to you?
Not really, but it's a better argument. And what I'd really like to do is to I'd like to see Michael Brown and James White debate. That'd be fun, wouldn't it?
That would be awesome. Yeah.
Why are they debating people like me? I'd like to see them debate each other sometime. I think Michael would wipe him up, frankly. But it doesn't make any sense. I mean, if he wanted to do that. He could have combined the two verses the way Jewish interpreters would do, where you quote one and then you quote the other and that you interpret them in light of each other. That would work. But to say that he's intentionally saying Jeremiah so that you'll think Zechariah or it's like he does, where else does he do that? For example, does Michael have examples of that happening in other places? We have other instances like this in the New Testament where at the very beginning of Mark's Gospel, chapter 1, where it says, as is spoken of, as is said in Isaiah the prophet, referring to John the Baptist, make way of the Lord, prepare his path, that guy. That's not from Isaiah. So it does happen sometimes. People misquote passage. I bet even Michael Brown sometimes will attribute a passage to the wrong place. And it may be that Matthew had this thing in mind that he himself thought about the connection of these two things, and he gave the wrong word. It's not a big deal for me. He just said it's the wrong, gave it the wrong. We all do that. But if you believe in inerrancy, then it's a problem.
Now, this last passage, I didn't find any prominent apologists addressing it, but Matthew 1:23 quotes Isaiah 7:14.
Behold, a virgin shall be with child, and shall bring forth a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which being interpreted is God with us.
But from an inerrantist, proof-texting Christian, it would be notable that we have no record of anyone calling Jesus Emmanuel.
Right. I'm surprised that there are apologists who could come up with an answer. I can come up with an answer. Of course, I used to be an apologist, so maybe that's why. So the passage is, it's quoting the Isaiah 7:14, which is problematic for obvious other reasons. He quotes it as saying, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and you shall call his name Emmanuel. And it's problematic because in the Hebrew, it doesn't say that a virgin shall conceive. It says a young woman has conceived. And the thing is, and she'll bear a son. This is in Isaiah 7. And if you actually read Isaiah 7, there's nothing about this child being born, being named, given the name Emmanuel, I don't think. This is about someone else. So what I would say is that it does not say that his name will be Emmanuel. Emmanuel means God is with us. It says that his name shall be called Emmanuel. In other words, it's different between naming somebody and calling them something. The name is Jesus. And it means God is with us because Jesus means, salvation from Yahweh. And so I think what I would say is that it's not saying that they will name him Jesus. They'll name him Emmanuel. They'll name him Jesus, but his name will be called God is with us because in Jesus, God is with us.
We don't have record, though, of anyone specifically saying, hey, there goes God with us or anything like that. We're just kind of inferring.
Well, I'd say throughout a lot of the New Testament, the idea is that in Jesus, God is with us. God is present with us in Jesus. And so I think it's perfectly consistent with what there probably are passages that say something like that. I don't know. Okay. You memorized Matthew. Why did you do the other?
I did. No, well, I didn't see me in Matthew. So actually, yes, what you're saying is a skeptic probably shouldn't look at this as a gotcha mistake.
No, I don't see this as a gotcha. I'm all for gotchas, but I think that this is just saying that the name is going to signify that God is with us. If I were an apologist, by the way, what I would say is that it's his full name. First name was Jesus, last name was Christ, and the middle name was Emmanuel. Jesus, Emmanuel, Christ.
Well, but it doesn't start with H. It's Jesus H. Don't you know?
Yeah. Good point. Yeah.
All right. Well, your course isn't about the failures of Matthew. It's about the genius of Matthew. So what will people learn when they sign up and take the full 8-lecture course by heading over to tinyurl.com/BartMatthew?
Well, some of these things I don't touch on, because I'm not using Matthew as kind of a gotcha thing or trying to show, why it's all messed up. I think it's really a brilliant book. And as an atheist, I think that it's really a very interesting and powerful portrayal of Jesus. And so what I do in the course is I show how best to kind of come away with an understanding what Matthew's conveying in his portrayal of Jesus. And I introduce redactional analysis, redaction criticism, which is the study of how somebody edits a source. And so a lot of my course is showing that since Matthew used Mark as one of his sources of information, how does he change Mark? What does he add to Mark? He adds a lot of stuff, And if he adds something to Mark, it means that he thinks it makes it better to have these stories. And so it really pays to look at these additions. There are places where he'll take a story in Mark and he'll modify it. And so you have, why does he modify it like this? Why is he changing things? That, he'll just like change a word, and sometimes it'll change the whole meaning of a passage. So it takes careful study to do that kind of analysis. And what I do in my course is I spend about 6 lectures kind of showing various places where that happens and expounding what Matthew's trying to achieve by all of that, and how Matthew's portrayal is so distinctive and very creative in many ways. I have a whole thing on the Sermon on the Mount, for example, and I try to deal with issues like when Jesus says, you've heard it said, you should not commit murder, but I say don't commit it. Don't even, get angry with somebody.
Right.
I try to explain that and try to show how the typical Christian explanation for that is not right, which is, many Christians say Jesus says, you can't get angry, you can't lust. Obviously, he can't really mean it. Surely he knows, right? And so since he doesn't mean it, what he's doing is he's showing that the law is impossible to keep. And since it's impossible to keep, you need Jesus. That's the Christian typical evangelical line. And I think it's completely wrong. I try to explain why I think it's wrong and try to show what I think passages like that mean. And I try to show how the Lord's Prayer is a very apocalyptic prayer, talking about the coming end, and that it's, people don't even think about what they're saying when they say it. But you pay attention, it's really interesting from an apocalyptic perspective. And so I do all of that. Then I have one of the lectures is on who was Matthew. Could Matthew the tax collector have written Matthew the gospel? And I go to an entire lecture trying to show why that's almost certainly not the case.
Right.
I deal with things like, didn't tax collectors have to be literate? I kind of deal with all that stuff. People say stuff they just don't know. And then I have a lecture on like textual variants in Matthew.
Oh, okay.
And why that Jeremiah thing, by the way, gets changed. Some manuscripts change it. Yeah, because the scribes didn't like it either, so they changed it to Zechariah. But also I look at, how did it become part of the canon, and what happens when you put it in the same canon with Mark, Luke, and John, and Paul. Matthew and Paul seem to be at odds. What happens when they're in the same book? You read them differently. And so anyway, the lecture was, these lectures were so much fun to do. And I certainly point out problems with Matthew. I certainly do that. But I'm not, this isn't like one of those things where I'm like trying to trash something in the Bible. It's really interesting stuff for me, historically.
Now, don't give us an answer here, but will we learn in the course whether Matthew was Jewish or not? You'll
learn my opinion about it. And you'll learn why it's so problematic. People always assume it. Like, I had a PhD student 2 weeks ago. I told him I wasn't sure. I told him why. I said, well, there's this. And really? It's just like nobody's ever thought about it. I said, yeah, you better think about it.
All right. Well, once again, go to tinyurl.com/Bart Matthew to sign up for this course. I've just started it myself. And if you join from that link, you'll also be helping this channel. So thank you for that. Bart, thank you so much for joining us again today. A pleasure as always. I've learned a lot.
Yeah, this is fun. Thanks so much.
Thanks for watching. Until next time, later.